Right, class, we're looking at the star delta starter. Remember, with this starter, it uses 3 contactors, but there are only 2 contactors that are used during the running cycle. It uses the main contactor and the delta connected contactor at the same time when the motor is running at full speed, but at startup it's using the star contactor and the main contactor. So the purpose of the star contactor is that it will carry the star current while the motor is running during startup. The reason for this is to limit the current at startup, whereas in delta the motor will be running at full speed, and so this is the purpose why it switches from the star at startup, and then the star contactor switches off and it now engages at full speed using the delta starter. We'll have red, yellow, blue, our L1, L2 and L3. This will be our 3-phase breaker, main circuit breaker, or the MCB, miniature circuit breaker, which will break all 3, right? So the reason we have this main breaker is to prevent overload conditions. So should the currents become excessive, the main breaker will disconnect L1, L2 and L3. We'll have the main contactor called K3, followed by the overload relay just before the 3-phase motor. K2 will be called the delta contactor. Wiring up the red, the yellow and the blue. So notice how it's wired up, okay? The red, the yellow, the blue. Contactor K3 is wired up in star. Notice the top, the blue, the yellow and the red. The idea here is that Q1 is the main breaker. So notice in this diagram there's no really on switch, but this is like the schematic layout of it, okay? And then you have a more simplified schematic layout where it will now give you with the start button and the stop button. The start and the stop button will be included, but you have to write down the explanation of how the circuit works. This is the wiring diagram of the star delta. Notice you have to explain the operation of how it works when the start button is pressed. Now notice there's no start button, but we do have Q1, which is the main breaker. Note well that this is the wiring diagram of the star delta. Now sometimes they will ask for the schematic diagram. Then when you draw the schematic diagram will have a stop and start button. You have to write the explanation when the start button is pressed. When the starter button is pressed, the main contactor K3 and the star contactor K1 are closed. After a set time that is programmed, there will be a timer. After a set time on the timer will open the star contacts. Then the delta contactor will close, and so it will shift from moving in star and it now will be connected in delta, controlled by a timer. Notice in the circuit there's no timer. So once the starter kicks in, notice the star is opened and the delta is closed. The starter has 4 states. The off state, all the contactors are open. The star state, the main and the star contactors are closed. Next, we'll look at the open state. The main contactor is closed and the delta contactor is still open. No current can flow. The delta state, the main and the delta contactors are closed, but notice that the star is now open. The motor is connected to the full line voltage and full power and torque. is now available. Looking at the summary of the star delta starter, what is the purpose of it? So the purpose is to reduce the high starting currents that are at startup. So for this reason, it first connects in a star state to allow for low currents, but the motor won't have full torque. After the timer kicks in, so the timer will kick in, it'll switch off the star and connect the delta. Now the motor will be exposed to a greater power, so the motor will be working at full efficiency in the delta connection. So remember, with delta connection we will get full power and more torque, so full torque will be available. So this is why it switches from star at startup and then it switches to delta after the timer switches off the star and engages the delta. That is practically your star delta circuit. Now we are looking at the schematic diagram. Notice it's still 3 phases, but they just use one L to represent the 3 phases. So we have the 3 phases coming down, followed by the overload relay, a normally closed stop button, then the start button will follow. The normally open start button will trigger K3, which is the main contactor, and it will also be followed by a timer. Notice we have timer switches, a timed on and a timed off delay. Notice that the delta contactor will have a normally open on delay, because remember, the delta after the timer is kicked in, it'll only switch on afterwards, so it'll have an on delay. K1, the star contactor, will have a normally closed off delay, because at startup the starter will be connected. The star section will be connected at startup. Then it will be when the timer kicks in, it'll then be timed to go off. So that means it will be normally closed, so that the star part contactor can be activated, and after the timer kicks in, that switch will open. So that means it had to be normally closed with an off delay, meaning it would switch off afterwards. Alright, so notice the star delta starter. Notice it's a little different from the one in the textbook. Notice that the thermal overload relay is first before the contactor K3, before the main contactor. But normally your overload thermal relay will be closer to the motor. So as the motor gets hotter, the overload relay will kick in. But it doesn't really matter. But I think let's keep to the one in the textbook. So notice in this picture it's showing you 3 contactors and it's showing you how it's wired up. Okay, notice on the far right, that will be the star. Right, so this is actually a picture with the 3 contactors there connected up. Notice the coloring: red, yellow, blue, line 1, line 2 and line 3. The earth wire as well, also connected. So can you see the actual wiring is way more complicated. On the extreme right hand side, that's the timer that is set, which will now disengage the star contactor and engage the delta contactor. Notice in this one there's 2 overload relays, overload relay 1, overload relay 2. So practically you need to just explain how it works, and sometimes they'll ask you identify the part, what is it. So notice the one right on top is the MCB, the one in orange. So in our wiring diagram, notice you might have to identify and say that's the main circuit breaker, or the MCB, miniature circuit breaker. Then we got K1, K2 and K3 in opposite directions here, you see. So notice that when you answering this question, if they answer it according to how it's labeled in the exam, maybe they'll switch around K1, K2 and K3. So if you look at this diagram, notice K1's on the left, whereas the one in the textbook, K3 is on the left. So when you're answering this, work with the labels that are on the diagram in the exam. Okay, right class, all the best.